Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I have made it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. This episode is brought to you by HarperCollins Australia.
Hello, listeners. My name is Cassie Hamer. I'm an author and your guest host for this episode of Talking Aussie Books, where I'm delighted to be speaking with Darry Fraser, bestselling author of more than 10 historical fiction novels, including her latest, The Adventuress of Albany, which features her trademark pillars of adventure, romance, and history. Darry, welcome to the podcast and congrats on this latest book. Such an intriguing and enlightening tale of false identity, blackmail, royalty, secret babies, a little murder thrown in, and love, all against the backdrop of colonial Australia. So many ingredients for a truly page-turning story about an era that I confess to knowing little about, but an age in Australian history that you seem particularly drawn to. Darry, what is it about 1880s and 1890s Australia that you find so fascinating?
The latter half of the 19th century, for me, is really quite interesting with regard to how women were perceiving themselves in that era. There's a wonderful quote that puts it into words for me. It's from Kate Grenfell in her book Letters of Mrs. MacArthur, where she edits the letters. And she says, "Don't believe too quickly." So I took that on board, and all the myths and legends and the gossip, if you like, about women not having their own voice, or women not sticking up for themselves, women being oppressed without a voice. Don't believe too quickly. So in the latter half of the 19th century, I felt that we were beginning to see cracks in that patriarchal screen, if you like, and women were coming to the fore. So ages ago, it seems like ages ago, when I was researching for The Widow of Ballarat, set in Eureka in 1854, there was lots of interesting bits and pieces that I discovered where women had started to put their foot forward and had started to demand this and that and the other thing. And historians can pinpoint that it was not only a pivotal point for the male franchise, they got the vote not long after that, but also that women had started to understand in this country that they could do more. So not that I am a historian, but I can see in that latter half how purposeful some women became. There was something else that was said to me in a review not long ago, which I won't give it any more voice than this, that my heroine is headstrong, just like what's in a Victorian pot boiler. And I thought, goodness gracious, does anyone still use the term headstrong? And I've never read a Victorian pot boiler to know what she was talking about. But that also gave me pause. That half of the 19th century didn't throw up imaginary figures who were headstrong. Human nature doesn't change. So if we're a personality type that takes us forward, we can be in 2025 or 1855. A lot about that period interested me. And then, of course, in 1896, South Australian women secured their first vote. So South Australian women, second only in the world to New Zealand, had the vote in that very last part of the 19th century. And so I'm seeing this lovely whirl of women standing up, and it takes generations, we know it does, but that's kind of where it gets really interesting for me.
So it seems like that period you see as a bit of a turning point, and I suppose the starting point for your novels is to imagine that women of today would want similar things that women of yesterday wanted as well. So independence, financial independence, freedom, including freedom over their bodies. And I think the main character in The Adventuress of Albany really embodies a lot of that. So let's talk a little bit more about that particular story. It's 1881, and near 30-year-old Englishwoman Molly Bentley is nearly trampled by a horse in the bustling port of Albany, Western Australia, where she's travelled from England in search of an adventure with her aunt, Mrs. Caldecott. When Molly comes to from being knocked over by the horse, she's in the home of an interesting, intriguing stranger, Leo McRae, who seems to know her. She also remembers a note being thrust into her hand moments before the accident, and it's a mysterious warning note that makes little sense, but it hints at her true identity. Now, who is Molly really? And what does she think that she's doing in Albany?
She has grown up a single only child, I should say, of privilege and an eccentric family. So she's been able to think for herself to a certain extent and is given some leeway in how she has lived her life. We tend to think that women were shoved into marriage against their will and so on and so forth in those days, but there were very, very many people who were treated well by their family and their parents in particular. But Molly has always wanted to travel. She hasn't wanted to marry and have children, which sounds as if it is unusual for the period. It's not unusual at all. But a lot of women were forced into marriage. There was no contraception, or their husbands didn't care to wear any, rough as it would have been. So she wants to go in search of adventure. Now, in the background is a lot of political intrigue, and I'm not a whiz at that sort of thing, but it was certainly going on at the time. And her father believed the safest place she could be was on the other side of the world. So that suited him without her knowing his reasons. And he was being the same as he's always been through her life, which was supporting, what she wanted to do. And she'd been a good girl, put it like that, where she loved their property, loved their horses, loved to be at home, wasn't terribly interested in the gentry or meeting royalty. So adventure was definitely on the cards for her. And that's not a far-fetched idea. Travel by ship was about the only way you could do it to get anywhere in the world if you didn't go by road. So lots of people did that sort of thing, and lots of women travelled on their own or with a chaperone. So we've sort of set the page for Molly to take her great journey across to Albany with her aunt. Her father knew she'd be safe. She just thought she was on this wonderful adventure.
It's fair to say that she's pretty confused at the start about what's going on. She thinks that she's there for an adventure being supported by her father, but it becomes clear pretty early on that there's some danger and that she's not quite safe where she is. So there is quite a lot of concealment that goes on for our main characters, Molly in particular, but also for Leo, the stranger that I just mentioned, in whose house she comes to after being knocked over by the horse. Fair to say that neither of them really have access to the full facts about why they're in the colony. And I'm wondering, how difficult was it to balance that slow reveal of information, but also maintaining suspense at the same time?
Good question. It became an issue of travel to begin with. So Leo and his cousin would sail across the ocean and back again in order to meet up and do the things that they had to do. So I was able to have Leo cross paths with Molly's father, Lord Cato, and build that sort of connection from there. And the fact that Molly, in my mind anyway, was living her life completely oblivious really to anybody outside the estate, and happy to do that. She had her aunt with her, who Lord Cato had, housed at the estate at home. And so she was just floating along thinking that she was getting through life exactly how she wanted to without a thought. But of course, Leo comes along and throws a spanner in that side of the works. And then, it was, as you say, it was a slow build, but I had to get that right. So it was a little bit tricky, but I hope I managed to get it across the line.
The other thing that you do really cleverly is to weave in some true historical events. And I'm referring there to a tour. Well, it wasn't really an official tour, but at the same time as we know that Molly's in danger and undertaking this journey, there's a parallel journey going on. And it's the royal princes, Albert and George. These were Queen Victoria's grandsons, and George was actually Queen Elizabeth's grandfather. Now, true to historical fact, they did make a visit to Hamilton in Victoria in 1881, and that was part of a long voyage around the planet. Now, I'm wondering what about that journey inspired this story, and can you describe that moment that you first read about it in Trove, I believe it was?
Something that is sometimes not so well known these days as historical fact, or some little nugget that's, you can uncover that sets you off. But in 1881, Queen Victoria's grandsons were 17 and 15. Albert was 17, George was 15, and they were midshipmen on the HMS Bacant. And midshipmen are the lowest of the low in the ranking. And I had no idea that this great tour had occurred then. We hear about 1867, where there was an assassination attempt on a visiting royal. Then we hear of Queen Victoria's son opening Parliament in 1901. But this particular tour is not quite as well known. So I'm reading away, and there's the Bacant hit a terrible, terrible storm off Fremantle, about 300 nautical miles out. And for 3 days, no one knew if the ship and all hands, including the royal grandsons, had sunk. And I thought, well, that's to me, that was adventure. So what happened there? And reading on, I realised that I could bring my characters to Albany, where the Bacant limped into port, and meet up with all that intrigue about the royals being on board. And suddenly there was a great flurry to have them tour while the rudder of the Bacant was being shipped from A to B to be fixed so that they could carry on this world tour. So how was I going to have my characters meet, or as you say, parallel with that particular historical event? And so I needed to go back an extra almost 20 years from my preferred time in the 19th century and pick that up. So then I had to think what was going on behind the scenes in Britain that would affect this sort of thing as well. But the wonderful thing I found about the touring was that they went to quite a lot of the places that I've already written about in other books. And when I first put this on the socials, this is what I was doing, somebody contacted me and said, "Oh, my great grandma, I was stood there at, let's say, Hamilton, I can't remember, waved the flag," and that was a great family folklore that she'd seen the young princes come out, stand out at the, wave to the crowd. So whilst it's not in living memory, there was at least one person whose ancestor had contact that way. And, who doesn't love the intrigue around royalty and whatever? So there were very interesting things going on in Britain at the time with the Irish people. And that's always fascinated me. So bringing it together was going to be a feat for me. And once again, I hope I got that right.
You mentioned there what was going on in England at the time in relation to the Irish, and that's another thread in this book. There's a suggestion that Molly may be in danger because her father, who's an earl, is supportive of the Irish farmers and of the Land League. So, what was that league? What was the bill that was going through at the time, and what was it trying to achieve?
It was the Irish Land Act, I believe, and it was to help secure tenure for the Irish farmers on land that the British had taken over or had bought or had decided they wanted for themselves, or whatever we want to call that. So this bill was going to give Irish tenants and their families a better deal. They could stay on the land, they could have tenure there on the land instead of being kicked out whenever the English lord felt that, he wanted something to do something else with the land. And of course there was pushback on it because, that meant that some of the landlords would lose some of their power and some of their financial security. And so that was only hinted at in the big swathes of stuff that I read and tried to follow. But I picked up on that because that would have been terrifying, first of all, for those snobby old British lords to lose some of their holdings that weren't really theirs when it came down to it. And also that the Irish people were still in this fight to regain some control over their land. So if an English lord was backing the Irish, let's say, he was then likely to take some flack from his peers or his, upper class noblemen. So I wanted to have that as a little bit of a danger in the story that may or may not have been a real thing. As it turns out, the danger was closer to home. Yeah.
So when you sit down to write your books, do you start with the character or do you start with the inspiration of some true historical events?
Over the last few books, I can't tell you how many, I've tried to find that historical nugget and then ask the what ifs. But you don't want to be in my head really when this is happening, because I'll be minding my own business looking through Trove, and then, I might go down the street, I might need something at a supermarket, and then suddenly a character appears out of nowhere. And, well, I don't know if it's strange or not, but female characters will appear on my left side and male characters on my right, so not necessarily at the same time. So suddenly I've got this whirl in my head of historic events, the what ifs, the who is this woman, who is this man. I like to ask them their profession or their interests in the case of the woman in that particular period of time, and him. And I don't want them to be too far out of what we would understand these days. So is he a farmer? Okay, we all get that. Is he a drover? We get that. I don't want him to be a chevalier. Well, what on earth is that? So I try to just ordinary people trying to get through their lives just like we do today, with the political events that are going on around them, whether that's small town events or whether that's national events. It's a tricky period of time for me because I don't sleep. I do eat. I eat, but sleeping is, one of those things you just let go. And then once the characters start to chatter, all hell breaks loose, really.
You just have to sit back and listen, it sounds like. I'm sure it's not that easy though. But you've said that your preferred period is sort of that 1890s. And for this book, you did have to go a little bit earlier than that. So did that involve having to do some further research? Because I imagine that after setting a few books in the 1890s, you do get a good handle on the world and how people speak and what people wear and what's going on at the time. But even bringing it forward that extra sort of 10 or 20 years, did that make a difference to the research? And you also said that you were familiar with some of the places that you write about in the book and some of those places that the princes had toured. But I'm wondering if you did go back and sort of recreate some of that journey as well for this book.
I stuck pretty much to the prince's itinerary, and then where the characters and the princes converged, that was all fine. And then the characters had to go off on another tangent, shall we say. The research was, for me, mainly around what the women might have worn. The men's fashions did change, but not so noticeably if you were just going down the street to collect your groceries or whatever not. Bustles, for instance, were coming and going, and great big bustles had gone and smaller bustles were coming in and things like that. So I just had to be careful that what I mentioned was actually true for that particular era. Hats certainly changed, but I tend to have that little bit of her hat was pretty with feathers in it, and then gloss over that just in case a milliner comes to get me. But mainly it was, the carriage rides or what was going on politically in both countries. So I was trying to set not the minutiae of the day, but the bigger picture. So whilst I had something in my head about how people might have dressed, whether or not that made it to the page was here nor there for me, I did want to get the tour correct and the absolute joy that people in the country felt knowing they were doing up their little town to see the princes glide through in 3 minutes. That was palpable. That came off the page. So I didn't have to, let's say, twiddle too much, and I didn't recreate anything of the prince's journey. I allowed well, I always keep history or the timeline true to itself, and just had my characters jump when they needed to.
Talked about this a little bit earlier, that 1880s, 1890s Australia was a deeply patriarchal society, as it was in England and everywhere else. Men dominated politics and households, and there were some very odd and disadvantageous rules around inheritance and illegitimacy, and they really come out in The Adventuress of Albany, which were very poor for women. And yet the heroines of your novels are strong, independent women. And you've said how, this is true to history. There were women like that who existed. But if you had to put yourself back in those times, what do you think it would have been like for you? Or what are the things about that period that most stand out to you as being so deeply unfair to women?
1873, I think, the Women's Marriage Act, where they were finally allowed by law to keep the property they took to a marriage. Well, a lot of women were independent thinkers. Whether they could do too much with that was another thing. But if I bring it back to personality again, and should I land in the 1890s, I would hope that, first of all, I married someone I wanted to marry, and that what little property I may have brought with me became mine, and that as husband and wife, shall we say, I would have an equal say in the family home. He would do the voting until 1896, certainly in South Australia, for the pair of us, I might add. But I would hope that I would master the art of riding side saddle, even though I hated it. I would prefer to ride astride, which they were allowed to do, but we don't tend to believe they were. Well, they were. They were wearing pants, but they had a skirt over the top of that. So, there are lots of little things in there that we tend not to see in the movies, or I would be busting, as all my heroines are, to make that first vote. Would I have gone on to become a professional something or other? There wasn't much that I could do about that. And so I don't find, my heroines are not going to become Florence Nightingale. They're going about their business the best way they can. And if they can find something that they can put that independence to, then Elsa Goody Bushranger, all she wanted to do was stay on the family farm, but she wasn't going to be allowed to, because women in those days were not allowed by law to be called farmers. If she didn't have husband or brothers to support her, then she had to go. So I would hope that had I landed back there, I could at least bring my flushing toilet with me, live my life as best as I could. I understand there would have been many people browbeaten by society, and some who were quite happy to be, I want to say, oppressed, for want of a better word. And then there were others who longed for different things, like a number of authors that we know, Miles Franklin, Jane Austen, even 250 years back. Lots of people did come to the fore in their own lives, but we didn't hear about it. But it is in there, in between the lines, read between the lines of history, and don't believe everything you read as as face value. Yeah.
It is a great message, and it's one that seems to be really resonating with readers as well. There is this growing genre of fiction which gives voice to the voiceless women, the ordinary, everyday women of yesteryear. And it's one that, audience do really respond to. And I love the fact that this book, The Adventuress of Albany, is dedicated to one of your readers and her carer. Can you tell me a little more about Joan Banks and why you decided to dedicate this to her and her carer, Larissa? And I'm wondering if you got to meet.
While I was on Kangaroo Island, the residential care home wasn't far from where I lived. So I'd often walk past people I knew worked there and whatever not. And Larissa was one of those women. And we'd wave and say hi, and she'd pat the dog, and, off we'd go. And I guess we talked about, an island being a small environment, knowing everybody. So she would know what I did for a living, and I certainly knew what she did for a living. Anyway, I moved off the island, and then I was contacted by private message one day by Larissa. Hi, Darry. I knew you on Kangaroo Island, da 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 da. one of your biggest fans is here in this residential care home that I've now moved to in Melbourne. And is it possible if we could have a FaceTime? Well, that was absolutely delightful for me to hear. So we FaceTimed, and Joan was a lively octogenarian, and she wanted to know all about what I did, and she's read every word I've ever written. And how serendipitous was it that Larissa, her carer, knew me, and la la la. So we had a good 45 minutes to an hour on FaceTime, lots of laughs, lots of giggles. And right at the end of that, I thought, she's got a really good story herself. And her story is actually in those pages in the book, where she came to Australia from England 60 years ago, met and married an Aussie fella, and they had a fine old time. She was very independent for her day. I don't think she said, she was 10-pound pom or whatever we're allowed to say now, but she made it out here by herself and made her own way. And, 60 years ago, what are we talking? I can't do the maths. 1960 would have been still fairly pioneering for women in this country. And I thought her story was really great. Anyway, we finished with the FaceTime. Oh, prior to finishing, I said, could I use your name in my book? Oh, well, that was just the bee's knees. That was the best thing that anybody could have said to her all that, well, for that hour, I suppose. Oh, she was delighted, and Larissa was delighted. So I made sure I could weave a much older character into the book who wanted to impart some wisdom to Molly about her life and about her independence, and how that there were older women who were very keen to make sure it was better for those who came after them. It wasn't even, I can't remember how long after Larissa contacted me and said Joan had passed away. So I was more than happy to make that part of the book meaningful, not just a passing acquaintance that the two women had. So Larissa is waiting with bated breath to receive her finished signed copy. And we'll say a little something to Joan when we launch.
Oh, I love that story. It's so beautiful and just shows how important our readers are to us, each individual one. And I think there's a theme that is emerging in our chat today of women who seek out adventure by moving to new places. And I can see that somewhat as well in your own life. You said that your creativity really soared when your family moved from Melbourne to Swan Hill. Why is that?
We got to Swan Hill when I was about 8. I'm really hard pressed to have any memories prior to that surface. So my sharpest memories of being arriving in Swan Hill is seeing the river for the first time. And even as an 8-year-old, I was mesmerised by this massive ribbon of water that just sailed serenely past this child. I knew then, even as an 8-year-old, that it was a big river and it did things like flooding towns and whatever, and I was fascinated by it. I was also fascinated by yesteryear, if you could say. We only spent 5 years there, but the river never left me. The pioneer settlement that they had started up there took this little kid on a time travel. And when they first set it up, you used to have to walk from the car park through the old paddle steamer, the Gem. And then as you got to the other side, the pioneer settlement opened up. And I really felt like I was time traveled. I was fascinated. You couldn't keep me away from the place. And so river trade, river travel, the river itself fascinated me from then. And I was devastated when we had to leave that area, truly devastated. But I've never forgotten how I felt when I was there. Those were the days when new housing developments, or as they were then, were opening up. So there were great big wide roads and they were dirt. And I'd imagine that I was on my horse galloping along or whatever on these dirt roads. And it just opened up something in me. And as I got older, I wondered where our Australian history stories were of the type that I'm now writing. And there were very, very, very few of them. That hasn't left me either. Now, whether that's, a good thing to hang on to or not, I enjoy myself immensely. And it all started with that first 8-year-old child's view of that river 1,000 years ago now.
It's interesting because I was a child, well, I am a child of the 80s as well, and I do remember being obsessed by the mini-series All the Rivers Run with John
Oh,
Waters and Sigrid Thornton. But I was a bit devastated to hear that this series was the one that actually really put the kibosh on your writing ambitions. Tell us what happened there, because you'd started writing your first book, Daughter of the Murray, in 1982, but it would not be published until more than 30 years later. And in a way, it seems like we have John Waters and Sigrid to blame for all of that.
okay, so we've gone past the 8-year-old. That was in the 60s. And in the early 80s, I'd moved to Alice Springs, part of the personal adventure again. And in Alice Springs, we hadn't yet got television. And when television arrived, one of the first series that came to TV was All the Rivers Run. But prior to that, I'd started to write the greatest novel known to man. I've still got it here somewhere. That no one will ever look at that. And, it was about a woman heading up a company of paddle steamers. And she hadn't got there because she'd fought her way to the top. She got there by default, but she was hanging on to it. She knew she was allowed to. Would men work for her? No. But anyway, so she was going along on her journey. All the Rivers Run came to TV, and I was devastated that that looked to be my plot. Now, I had no clue that Nancy Cato had written it in 1957 or whenever it was, and I was devastated. So, having written the greatest novel known to man, of course, I was mortified that I could have been accused of plagiarism. So, I took my little imposter self and the manuscript and tucked it in the bottom drawer, brought it out of mothballs over that 30 years. And then with Sigrid and John way behind me and that story in Australian filmmaking folklore, I thought, oh, I might bob up again. And of course, by the year 2000, Australian historicals were passé. And I thought, well, I don't care, I'm still writing. And then by 2012, other things had happened in my life, and I thought, it's now or never. And that's the only full manuscript I had. So I brought it out. I studied what was going on around me as far as trends and storylines, and pitched it in 2015 to the lovely Sue Brockhoff at HarperCollins. Poor woman, she sat through 3 minutes of stuttering while I pitched it. And they picked it up 3 months later. So I've been very fortunate.
I know that you were such a keen writer from such a young age, but it took so many decades and persistence and dipping in and out of it for you to really achieve that dream. But once you did, what did that feel like?
Euphoria. Looking back over the vast years now, it seems that that was my thing. I was supposed to write stories, but I got this huge fright in the 80s, which probably baseless, but I got this huge fright. And I did everything I could work-wise to ensure that I didn't go back to writing. So when push came to shove and I hit rock bottom and beyond, there was only one thing I could use to pick me up out of that. And it was the thing I think I was always meant to do. Now, rightly or wrongly, good writer or not, that was the thing I was meant to do. I was meant to tell stories. So from 2012, shall we say, I got on with it.
And it seems like moving, as we've spoken about, moving into different landscapes has also been important in your life. You had that period in Swan Hill. You have had a period in Alice Springs where you held a variety of jobs. You had quite an extended period on Kangaroo Island. And you now moved into a new chapter of your life in Goolwa. What's that like for you so far?
It's wonderful here, really wonderful. The Goolwa still has a small country town feel to it, and yet it's an hour from the city if you need to do bits and pieces that way. And it puts me back on the river. The Murray runs to sea here at Goolwa, and that's magical for me. That's the only word I've got for it. It's absolutely magical for me. I have another friend who lives further upriver on the river, and other friends dotted along. I visit Swan Hill and beyond. So the river has always remained, I'm going to say, an important part of my life. And coming to Goolwa wasn't planned, but I've Since 2012, I've just followed my nose with regard to writing the stories, and because the river is a big part of those stories, I got such a shock when I decided to purchase the house at Galway, and then it just dawned on me, here I am, this is where I'm meant to be, and this is where I'm staying.
It's so interesting because I can again see parallels with Molly or Lady Mary's story in The Adventuress of Albany. Her story really is a search for belonging. She feels at home in the rough and tumble of the colony, but she's really still looking for her proper place in the society and a place where she can settle and be happy. And look, without giving away spoilers, what do you hope readers take away from Molly's journey by the end of the book?
That a young woman of her day had opportunities. She needed support. We all know that. But not every father was an ogre. Not every man she met was a horrorhead. Not everybody wanted to keep the patriarchal boot on her. But that was the era, society-wise, family-wise, law that she lived in. But that her spirit kept her going. And if someone said, no, you can't do that, well, she'd have a think about that and she'd find a way to do that with, but she didn't need to be Superwoman. She just had to find her way around things as befit her personality. So I hope that readers can see something of themselves in her, because again, human nature doesn't change. There will be a similar personality to Molly out there reading this and going, yeah, I know, human nature doesn't change, so I can use a very modern woman's nature, transplant it into the era and regulate how she reacts because of the era she's in. But her spirit doesn't change, it doesn't fade away. So I hope readers can see something of themselves in Molly and in Mrs. Caldecott, Mrs. Sloane, that women were okay. It just, we're told they weren't, but they were.
She is definitely a very relatable woman. She's sensible. She has hopes and ambitions, but she doesn't panic. She thinks things through carefully. She's realistic. She's pragmatic as well. But by the end of the book, I think we do get a nice sense of resolution to her story, but also there is an open-endedness to it as well. So given that, I'm wondering, we get a sense of what the future is for Molly/Mary in the book, but I'm wondering, what does the future hold for Darry Fraser? It seems almost cruel to say, what is the next book when you've just finished one and put your, blood and guts into all of that. But what is next for you, Darry?
Story 2026 is done. It's been accepted by my publisher. That will shift slightly from my usual type of story. It is set in that last decade once again on the river. I haven't looked at that since it's been accepted, but it's working its way through the editorial process now. And Story 2027 is also done, and I've used the premise there, still on the river, but that's because just prior to Federation, the colonies operated as very separate type entities, and there was lots of smuggling going on. So the river played a big part in smuggling, and I'm not sure we're all aware how big a deal that was in the day. So I had a lot of fun with that one. Again, a little bit different to what I've done before, but not stepping too far out of what people would expect of my stories. Adventure again, the history. Now I'm looking for something for Story 2028. And whether or not I'm accepted, I sincerely hope I will be, the stories, I'm going to keep writing. Because I've been fortunate enough that my readership has grown with every book, which says to me that especially Australian readers are looking for readability, something they can relate to, maybe a little bit of history they weren't aware of, but adventure, because whether we think so or not day to day, we do all have adventure in our life. Maybe not galloping horses and tearing away with some fellow, but, adventure. I'm not stepping too far outside of what I've done before, but I have grown as a writer and I'm exercising that growth. Yeah.
Fantastic to hear everything that you've got on the boil. And you said there that you have grown as a writer, and you and I both know that it's very hard to get published, but it's almost even harder to stay published. There are a lot of aspiring writers who listen to this podcast. So what would your best advice be to them, either about growing as a writer or about sticking with it over a long period of time?
I was lucky that I jagged the right place at the right time, but my greatest advice to myself, as much as anyone else, is to put your backside in that seat and write and write and write and write and write. If you want to take the advice, write what you know, go ahead, but then you don't know an awful lot as well. So do like I do and research. One of the things I do love to do, if you're writing in this particular genre, go to the place and step in the dirt. Go and sit by the river. Go and let the flies buzz around your face. Go and let the eucalyptus waft past your nose. Get a real feel and show somebody you trust to tell you the truth about your story. Show someone what you're writing. If it's your mum, she might say, yes, dear, that's lovely. My mum said, oh, no, I think you can do better than that. So you've got to find your way there, but the best advice is to sit in that seat, block everything else out and do the work.
Do the work. And luckily you're someone who has taken your own advice. You've done all the work and you've produced a beautiful body of work, and it sounds like there's so much more to come. So Darry, I just want to thank you for your time today and wish you all the best with the next books as well.
Thanks very much, Cassie. It's a delight.
That's it for this episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. If so, I'd love it if you'd leave a review on your preferred listening platform, which may include Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon Music. Until next time, friends, happy reading!